Sarah Morrison knew what fear tasted like. It tasted like copper and salt, like blood and tears mixed together on a split lip. She had learned this flavor well during her 3 years of marriage to James Morrison, a respected banker in Philadelphia society. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple. James wore tailored suits and smiled at dinner parties. Sarah wore high-collared dresses that hid the bruises and smiled until her face ached. The first time he hit her was 6 weeks after their wedding in 1867. She had laughed too loudly at another man's joke. James waited until they got home, then backhanded her across the kitchen. The force sent her sprawling against the cast-iron stove. He apologized afterward, brought her flowers, promised it would never happen again. She believed him because she wanted to believe him, because admitting the truth meant admitting she had made a terrible mistake. But it did happen again. And again. And again. The violence became as regular as the seasons, as predictable as the rising sun. Some days he used his fists. Other days he used his belt. On the worst days, he used his words, telling her she was worthless, stupid, ugly, that no one would ever want her, that she should be grateful he even looked at her. The physical wounds healed, but those words burrowed deep into her soul like parasites, eating away at everything she had once believed about herself. Sarah stopped seeing her friends. She stopped visiting her family. James controlled every aspect of her life, what she wore, what she ate, where she went, who she spoke to. He gave her barely enough money for household expenses and demanded detailed accounting of every penny. When her mother tried to visit, James turned her away at the door, saying Sarah was indisposed. When her father wrote letters, James burned them before Sarah could read them. She became a ghost in her own life, invisible even to herself. The breaking point came on a freezing February night in 1870. James came home drunk and in a rage because a business deal had fallen through. He blamed Sarah, though she had nothing to do with it. He grabbed her by the hair and dragged her across the floor. He kicked her ribs until something cracked. He wrapped his hands around her throat and squeezed until black spots danced in her vision. In that moment, staring up at the hate-twisted face of her husband, Sarah realized with perfect clarity that he was going to kill her. Maybe not tonight, but soon. If she stayed, she would die in this house. When James finally passed out in his chair, Sarah moved despite the screaming pain in her ribs. She took only what she could carry, a small bag with a change of clothes, the $23 she had hidden in a flour tin, and her grandmother's locket. She left behind everything else, the furniture, the dishes, the life she had tried so hard to build. None of it mattered anymore. Only survival mattered. She walked through the dark streets of Philadelphia with no destination in mind, just the desperate need to put distance between herself and that house of horrors. The cold bit through her thin coat, but she barely felt it. Every step sent fire through her broken ribs, but she kept walking. At dawn, she found herself at the train station. She looked at the departure board through swollen eyes and saw a train leaving for the Western Territories in 20 minutes. She bought a ticket with trembling hands. She didn't know where she was going or what she would do when she got there. She only knew she had to disappear, had to become someone James could never find. As the train pulled away from the station, Sarah Morrison looked back at the city one last time. Then she turned her face toward the unknown horizon and let the old Sarah die. Whatever came next, it had to be better than what she was leaving behind. The train carried Sarah west for 3 days and nights. She watched the landscape transform through the window, cities giving way to farms, farms giving way to endless prairie. Each mile put more distance between her and James, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow still watching her, still controlling her. She jumped at every loud noise. She flinched when men walked past her seat. The other passengers gave her strange looks, but no one spoke to her. She was grateful for their silence. She got off in a small town called Rawlins in the Wyoming Territory. It was barely a town at all, just a handful of wooden buildings clustered around the railroad tracks, surrounded by vast stretches of nothing. The wind howled across the empty land like a wounded animal. Sarah stood on the platform with her small bag and watched the train disappear into the distance. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had done. She had no plan, no money beyond a few dollars, no friends, no family who knew where she was. She was completely alone in a harsh land she didn't understand. The first week was the hardest. She found work washing dishes at the only restaurant in town, a grimy establishment that served miners and railroad workers. The owner, a hard-faced woman named Mrs. Fletcher, paid her almost nothing and worked her from dawn until midnight. Sarah slept in a storage room behind the kitchen on a pile of flour sacks. Her ribs still ached with every breath. Her hands became raw and bleeding from the harsh lye soap. But she was free, and that made every hardship bearable. She kept to herself, speaking only when necessary. She learned to move through the world like a shadow, attracting no attention, making no connections. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. At night, she lay awake on her flour sacks and listened to the wind howl. Sometimes she cried silently, mourning everything she had lost. Other times she felt nothing at all, as if James had beaten all the feeling out of her along with her hope. Spring came to Wyoming with reluctant warmth. Sarah had been working at the restaurant for 2 months when Mrs. Fletcher told her they were expecting an important group for dinner, a delegation of Lakota leaders who had come to meet with the Indian agent. Mrs. Fletcher warned Sarah to stay in the kitchen and not make eye contact with the Indians. "They are unpredictable," she said with disdain. "Best to keep your distance." Sarah had never seen a Native American person before. Everything she knew about them came from newspapers and stories, most of which painted them as dangerous savages. But when the delegation arrived that evening, she couldn't help but peek through the kitchen door. There were 5 men, all dressed in a mixture of traditional clothing and items they had adopted from white culture. They moved with a dignity that seemed completely out of place in the shabby restaurant. One man stood out from the others. He was tall and broad-shouldered, probably in his mid-30s, with long dark hair and features that looked carved from stone. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention. They were dark and observant, taking in everything around him with an intelligence that was impossible to miss. He carried himself like someone who had never doubted his place in the world, someone who had never been made to feel small. Sarah found herself staring, fascinated by this quality she had once possessed but lost somewhere along the way. The man suddenly looked directly at her through the crack in the door. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She expected anger or dismissal, but instead his expression softened with something that looked almost like concern. He could see the fading bruises on her face, she realized. The yellow-green marks James had left were still visible despite her attempts to hide them. The man's jaw tightened, and something fierce flashed in his eyes, not directed at her, but at whoever had hurt her. Sarah quickly ducked back into the kitchen, her heart pounding. She forced herself to focus on the dishes, on the familiar rhythm of wash and rinse and dry. But she couldn't stop thinking about that moment of connection, that look of understanding from a complete stranger. It had been so long since anyone had really seen her, had looked at her with anything other than contempt or indifference or pity. The evening stretched on. Sarah kept working, keeping her head down, trying to disappear into the background as she always did. But something had shifted inside her. That brief moment of being truly seen by another human being had cracked something open in her chest, letting in a tiny sliver of light. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't dare hope it meant anything at all. But for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Sarah felt almost human again. Sarah didn't see the Lakota delegation again for 2 weeks. She tried not to think about the man with the observant eyes, but his face kept appearing in her mind during quiet moments. There had been something in his expression that haunted her, a kind of recognition, as if he understood things about her that she had never spoken aloud. Life continued its hard rhythm. She worked, she slept, she avoided conversation. Mrs. Fletcher remained as cold and demanding as ever, but at least she paid regularly and asked no questions about Sarah's past. In a town where everyone knew everyone's business, anonymity was worth more than gold. One afternoon in early May, Sarah was walking back to the restaurant from the general store when she heard shouting. A crowd had gathered in the street. She tried to walk around it, wanting no part of whatever drama was unfolding, but the press of bodies blocked her path. She found herself pushed to the front of the crowd, where she could see what everyone was staring at. 3 white men had cornered a young Lakota woman against the side of a building. The woman looked barely 16, her face frozen in terror. The men were clearly drunk, their voices loud and cruel as they taunted her. One of them reached out to grab her arm, and the girl tried to pull away, which only made the men laugh harder. Sarah's stomach turned to ice. She knew that fear. She had lived that fear. Every instinct screamed at her to turn away, to keep walking, to protect herself. Getting involved would only bring trouble. She had survived this long by making herself invisible, by never drawing attention, by never taking risks. But as she watched the girl's terrified face, something inside Sarah snapped. Before she could think about what she was doing, she pushed through the crowd and stepped between the men and the girl. "Leave her alone," Sarah said, her voice shaking but clear. The men turned to look at her with bleary, surprised eyes. "Mind your own business, lady," one of them slurred. "I am minding my business," Sarah said, her heart hammering against her broken ribs. "This is wrong, and you know it. Let her go." The largest man took a step toward Sarah, his face darkening. You defending these savages? Maybe you need to be taught a lesson too. The crowd watched in silence. No one moved to help. Sarah realized with sick certainty that she had made a terrible mistake. She had drawn attention to herself. She had put herself in danger. Everything she had worked to avoid, she had just thrown away for a girl she didn't even know. But when the man raised his hand, Sarah didn't flinch. She had been hit before. She would survive being hit again. She looked him straight in the eye and waited for the blow. It never came. A strong hand caught the man's wrist in midair. Sarah looked up to see the tall Lakota man from the restaurant, the one with the observant eyes. He held the drunk man's arm effortlessly, his expression calm but his grip clearly painful. "The women are leaving," he said in perfect English, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "You will not stop them." The drunk man tried to pull away but couldn't break free. His friend stood frozen, suddenly less brave. The Lakota man released the drunk and turned to Sarah and the young girl. "Come," he said gently. "It's not safe here." Sarah found herself following him through the crowd, the Lakota girl close behind her. Her legs felt weak. Her hands were shaking. She couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The man led them to a small camp outside of town where several families were staying. He spoke to the girl in Lakota, his voice warm and reassuring. The girl nodded, wiping tears from her face, and hurried to one of the tents where other women welcomed her. The man turned back to Sarah. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the strength in his features, the careful way he moved to avoid startling her. "You were very brave," he said. "Or very foolish. Possibly both." Sarah let out a shaky laugh that was almost a sob. "Definitely foolish. I don't know why I did that. I should have just walked away." "But you didn't walk away," the man said, his dark eyes studying her face. "Why?" Sarah opened her mouth to give some easy answer, but found she couldn't. The truth spilled out instead. "Because I know what it feels like to be helpless. I know what it's like when no one helps you, when everyone just watches and does nothing. I couldn't be one of those people anymore." The man nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected. "My name is Mapia Luta. In English, it means Red Cloud. I am chief of the Oglala Lakota." He paused. "And you are running from someone who hurt you." It wasn't a question. Sarah's breath caught. She wanted to deny it, to protect herself with lies, but what was the point? This man already saw through her. "Yes," she whispered. "Then you should not go back to that town," Red Cloud said simply. "Those men will be angry. They will want revenge for being embarrassed. You are not safe there." He gestured to the camp. "Stay here tonight. Tomorrow we can talk about what to do." Sarah spent that night in the camp of the Oglala Lakota, an experience so far removed from anything in her previous life that it felt like stepping into another world. The women gave her food and a place to sleep in one of the lodges. They spoke little English, and she spoke no Lakota, but kindness needed no translation. They could see she was hurt, that she was running, that she was broken. They didn't pry. They simply made space for her. Red Cloud came to speak with her the next morning. They sat outside under the vast Wyoming sky, and he asked her to tell him her story. Sarah hesitated at first. She had spent so long hiding the truth, keeping her shame locked inside. But something about his calm presence and patient silence made her want to speak. So she told him everything, about James, about the violence, about her escape, about the fear that still lived in her bones. Red Cloud listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Among my people, a man who beats his wife brings shame upon himself and his family. He is not a man. He is a coward. This James is a coward, and you were right to leave him." The simple validation brought tears to Sarah's eyes. No one had ever said that to her before. Everyone else had implied she must have done something to deserve it, that she should have tried harder to be a better wife, that marriage was sacred and she should have endured. But Red Cloud said plainly what she had needed to hear: it wasn't her fault. She had done the right thing. "You are welcome to stay with us," Red Cloud continued. "We leave tomorrow for our lands to the north. It is a hard journey, but you would be safe. No white man's law reaches there. He could not find you." Sarah stared at him in shock. "Why would you help me? You don't know me. I'm nothing to you." Red Cloud's expression grew thoughtful. "I have watched the white men take everything from my people, our land, our buffalo, our way of life. They make treaties and break them. They tell lies and call them truth. They hurt the weak and call it civilization." He met her eyes. "But I have also learned that suffering is suffering, no matter the color of skin. When I see someone who is hunted and afraid, I remember that my people are also hunted and afraid. Perhaps we cannot save everyone. But we can save someone. Today, that someone is you. Sarah didn't know what to say. The offer was too big, too strange, too unexpected. Leave civilization entirely? Live among the Lakota? It was unthinkable. It was insane. And yet, what did she have to go back to? A minimum wage job washing dishes? A storage room behind a kitchen? The constant fear that James would somehow find her? She looked around the camp. Women were preparing food over fires. Children played and laughed. Men worked on weapons and tools. There was order here, community, purpose. Yes, their lives were hard, she could see that clearly. They lived in constant negotiation with the government, constantly pushed further from their traditional lands. But there was also something here that Sarah had never had in Philadelphia society: genuine connection. These people belonged to each other. They took care of each other. They didn't hide their suffering behind false smiles and high collars. "I don't know your ways," Sarah said hesitantly. "I don't speak your language. I don't know how to do anything useful. I would be a burden." "You will learn," Red Cloud said simply. "And as for being useful, you already proved your worth yesterday. You stood up for someone weaker when no one else would. That is the greatest usefulness of all." Sarah spent 3 more days in the camp before making her decision. She watched how the community functioned, how everyone had a role, how the women worked together with an efficiency born of long practice. The young girl she had defended, whose name was Zitkala, followed her everywhere, treating Sarah like a hero. The girl's mother gave Sarah a dress made of deer hide and taught her a few basic Lakota words through gestures and patience. Red Cloud spoke with her each evening, telling her about his people's history and their current struggles. He spoke of the wars they had fought to protect their lands, the treaties that were made and broken, the constant pressure from the white government to give up more and more. He spoke honestly about the hardships she would face if she chose to come with them. "Winter is brutal," he said. "Food is sometimes scarce. The soldiers harass us. We are always one bad season or one broken treaty away from disaster." "Then why do you stay?" Sarah asked. "Why not just accept what the government offers and try to make the best of it?" Red Cloud looked at her for a long moment. "Because some things are worth more than comfort or safety. Freedom is one of those things. Dignity is another. My people have lived on these lands since time beyond memory. We will not surrender them without exhausting every other option first." He paused. "I think you understand this. You gave up comfort and safety when you left your husband. You chose freedom and dignity instead." Sarah realized he was right. She had made that choice already. Going with the Lakota was just the next step on the same path. On the 4th day, she told Red Cloud she would come with them. He nodded as if he had known all along what her answer would be. That night, the women held a small ceremony to welcome her into the community. They gave her a new name, Wikapi Waste, which meant good star, because, they explained through a translator, she had appeared suddenly in the darkness like a guiding light for Zitkala. Sarah Morrison ceased to exist. Wikapi Waste took her first breath. The journey north was the hardest physical challenge Sarah had ever faced. She learned to ride a horse despite her lingering injuries. She learned to help set up and take down the camp. She learned to prepare food in ways completely foreign to her Philadelphia upbringing. Everything hurt. Every day brought new exhaustion. But every day also brought new strength. Her body grew tougher. Her hands stopped bleeding from the work. The fear that had lived in her chest like a stone began, very slowly, to dissolve. The women adopted her as one of their own. They taught her their language with patience and humor, laughing gently when she mispronounced words. They showed her how to tan hides, how to make pemmican, how to identify useful plants on the prairie. They taught her that strength wasn't about never showing weakness, it was about being honest about your struggles and accepting help when you needed it. This was revolutionary for Sarah, who had spent years pretending everything was fine while dying inside. Red Cloud kept his distance during the journey, but Sarah often caught him watching her with that same observant expression from their first meeting. She learned that he was a widower, that his wife had died in childbirth 3 years earlier along with their infant son. The loss had aged him, the other women told her, but had also deepened his compassion. He understood grief. He understood loss. He understood what it meant to have your world shattered. 6 weeks into the journey, they made camp near a river. Sarah went down to the water at sunset to wash. She stood at the edge looking at her reflection, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. The bruises were long gone. Her skin had bronzed from constant sun. Her eyes, which had been dull and dead in Philadelphia, now held something that looked almost like peace. "You are healing," Red Cloud's voice said behind her. She turned to find him standing a respectful distance away. "I can see it happening." "I feel like I'm becoming someone completely different," Sarah admitted. "Sometimes I can barely remember who I was before." "Perhaps that is good," Red Cloud said. "The person you were before was shaped by pain. The person you are becoming is shaped by choice." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the river. Then Red Cloud said, "I should tell you something. When I first saw you in that restaurant, I saw my sister in your eyes. She was married to a man who hurt her. Our people did not allow such things, we made him leave the tribe. But she was already broken inside. The wounds he gave her spirit never healed. She died 2 winters ago. When I looked at you, I saw her pain, and I thought maybe I could do for you what I could not do for her." Sarah's throat tightened. "I'm sorry about your sister. And I'm grateful. You saved my life, Red Cloud. I was dying slowly in that town, just like I was dying in Philadelphia. You gave me a reason to keep living." "No," Red Cloud said gently. "You saved yourself when you stepped between those men and Zitkala. That took a kind of courage I have rarely seen. I simply gave you a safe place to continue being courageous." Something shifted between them in that moment. The careful distance they had maintained dissolved. Red Cloud stepped closer, and Sarah didn't flinch or pull away. He reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat, and gently touched her cheek. His hand was warm and calloused from work, nothing like James's hands that had only ever brought pain. Sarah leaned into the touch, feeling something unfold in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. "I would like to court you properly," Red Cloud said. "If you would permit it. I know you have been hurt terribly. I know you may never wish to trust a man again. I am willing to wait as long as necessary. I only ask that you consider the possibility." Sarah looked up at this man who had shown her more kindness in weeks than James had shown in years. He was offering her a choice, not making demands. He was asking permission, not taking what he wanted. This was what respect looked like. This was what real strength looked like. "Yes," she whispered. "I would like that." The courtship was gentle and patient. Red Cloud brought her small gifts, wildflowers, interesting stones, a bird's feather. He sat with her in the evenings and taught her more of his language. He told her stories about his people and listened to her stories about the world she had left behind. He never pushed, never demanded, never made her feel anything less than equal. Slowly, carefully, Sarah learned that not all men were like James. Some men knew how to be gentle. Some men understood that real love was about building someone up, not tearing them down. They married in the autumn, in a traditional Lakota ceremony under an impossibly blue sky. Sarah wore a dress made of white doe skin that the women had decorated with intricate beadwork. Red Cloud wore his finest ceremonial clothing. The entire band celebrated with food and dancing and songs that Sarah was beginning to understand. As they stood together before the tribe, Sarah felt tears running down her face, but for the first time in years, they were tears of joy. That night, lying beside Red Cloud in their lodge, Sarah thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The brutal marriage that had almost destroyed her. The desperate escape. The lonely terror of those first weeks in Wyoming. The moment she chose to be brave. The community that welcomed her. The man who saw her worth when she couldn't see it herself. "Are you happy?" Red Cloud asked softly. Sarah considered the question. She thought about Philadelphia and everything she had lost. She thought about the hardships that still lay ahead, the coming winter, the uncertain future, the government's constant threats against the Lakota. She thought about how different this life was from everything she had been taught to want. And then she thought about the woman she had become, the strength she had discovered, the hope she had reclaimed. "Yes," she said with absolute certainty. "I am happy." Red Cloud pulled her close, his embrace gentle and protective. "My hope is to spend every remaining day of my life making sure you stay happy." Sarah smiled in the darkness. James Morrison had tried to kill her hope with his fists and his cruelty, but hope was harder to destroy than he had realized. It could be buried under years of abuse and fear, but it could not be extinguished completely. All it needed was someone to dig it out, brush it off, and give it space to breathe again. Red Cloud had done that for her. But more importantly, she had done it for herself when she chose to stand up for a frightened girl in a dusty street. That moment of courage had changed everything. It had reminded her that she was more than her suffering, more than her fear, more than the lies James had told her about her worthlessness. Outside the lodge, the stars blazed across the sky with impossible brightness. Somewhere far away, James Morrison probably still looked for her, still raged about her disappearance. But Sarah Morrison was gone, transformed into Wikapi waste, good star, and she was finally, truly free. The brutal marriage hadn't killed her hope. It had tested it, buried it, nearly smothered it completely. But hope, like Sarah herself, was a survivor. And now, held safe in the arms of a Lakota chief who valued her as an equal, that hope blazed as bright as the stars overhead, lighting the way toward a future she had never imagined but had somehow, against all odds, found.